Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Planning Commission podcast. Today's episode, Homelessness in America with Wyatt Schroeder.
The Planning Commission podcast is a spirited discussion with myself and a couple of my longtime colleagues in the profession. Our discussions are based solely on our own opinions and do not reflect the opinions or views of our employers, the American Planning Association, or even our alma maters. So grab a seat in the back of City Hall, dig out an old copy of Robert's Rules, and for goodness sakes, read your packet. The Planning Commission is now in session.
First of all, roll call. Commissioner Smith.
Present.
And Commissioner Koselleck.
Yo.
Yo. And I'm here. So let's go over our agenda real quick. We're going to go through our discussion item, our whiskey pairing, our interview, and then our lightning round. Can I get a motion to approve?
So move.
Second.
Perfect. Okay, and to our listeners, just as a reminder, you can find all our past meetings on our website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. Head up YouTube, Amazon, Apple, all the different ways. We appreciate your feedback, and we'll keep on doing our thing. Any episode ideas that you all have is another one of the things that we'd love to hear from you. So, our discussion item. This is an episode that we know is has a bit of a somber tone to it. There's a lot of unfortunate suffering, frankly, that comes along with this discussion. And we're going to get to the bottom of it with an expert in this field. But before we do, I want to make sure we kind of talk about it a little bit, our own impressions. So I got to ask my fellow commissioners, man, the planning profession that we're in, has planning helped or caused homelessness in some way or another? We like to think ourselves quite noble, don't we? But are we? Have we done things or contributed in ways, direct or indirect, that might have something to do with this? Any thoughts on that initially?
I mean, I'll go with kind of the thing that's front and center now of just what we know of our historic zoning regulations and the limitations that's placed on the housing availability and housing affordability that I think has a compounding effect on homelessness and has, worked to keep people out of the opportunities or put them kind of on just that knife edge of one way or the other of being able to afford housing. And I think with our guest today to kind of getting into defining what is homelessness, and it doesn't necessarily mean somebody that's just kind of out there living outside,
unsheltered, right?
The other side of it, though, I look at stuff that I think the planning profession was certainly a partner in when we learned with COVID of finding these hotels and places to lease to house homeless people, and just hearing the stories of people that either had certain medical conditions and were homeless that were able to have a safe, secure, and warm place every day, to families experiencing homelessness that because of that were able to have a room and a closet and things that were theirs and not have to leave a shelter during the day and come back. So I think let's be honest about where we've influenced that and be part of the solution and keep coming up with innovations and solutions that will help it.
I agree. I mean, I think part of this answer is you have to know our history, and you go back into the 1900, 1910s and the tenement housing that existed in our very heavy metro areas, especially in the East Coast. And we know that there was a public health crisis that came out of a lot of that. So what do? We do what we always do. We act in extreme ways and said, well, we can't allow anything like this to happen ever again. So let's spread out. Let's get everybody living on single story, 2-story, that sort of a thing, and change dramatically how our land use form is. And as land and people moved, or as people moved towards the West, and that land was much easier to come by, we have this proliferation of a development pattern that was also, I think, kind of one size fits all, right? We know the zoning code was copy paste. Well, look at us, it's no reason. Of course we can explain how we look. So
I think to that, I mean, complexities, if we start to just think of zoning and dividing cities up into a zone, and even in this day and age, we want to put in a new facility, a new shelter. the
Right.
people that are there and relying upon it, their access to jobs, to food, to transit is compromised and at least made a lot harder because of the
Yeah.
way we've segregated our land uses, and finding then the areas within the city that meet some criteria where those things are convenient, I would say would be much harder to do today in most places than even if we were to go back 100 years ago where we had more of a mixed use development pattern.
Yeah. Jess, you got something quick for this?
Just echoing that this is one of those things where it's a complex problem and it's a perfect problem for planners to attack and try and solve. But it is also one of the, like any planning problem, it's a wicked problem. As you try to solve it, it changes. And so these are the things that come to mind. And also realizing the causes of homelessness are so, they're broad. They touch all parts of people's lives. Even though some things that we're seeing more, a bigger segment is this. But when I was looking at numbers of kind of percentages of what causes homelessness, loss of job, loss of home, domestic issues, relationship change, income, wages, all of these things are attached to how we're living, right? And how our communities are supporting one another. And it, right down to how much we pay folks. So
yeah, it's complex, isn't it?
Yeah, and help. So it's one of those things that I think that we could do more work on, right?
Yeah,
But
I think people know the realities here.
Well, and the weird thing is that if you solved for this equation, you would solve other problems for other populations. So it's really interesting that it gets down to the point of being unhoused. So
that's a good point. So hopefully we're having our moment and recognizing, okay, we have work to do and we can be part of the solutions, even if we may have been part of the problem. First part of the solution is recognizing the problem, right? So with that, let's turn to our whiskey pairing. A little bit of a curveball here. And so we're going to introduce our guest now, Mr. Wyatt Schroeder, who's a principal at Bowling Business Strategies. Wyatt, first of all, thank you so much for joining the Planning Commission podcast.
Thanks for having me, commissioners.
All right. So Wyatt, we're going to hand this off to you. And your first action on this podcast is actually to do the whiskey pairing. So what do you have for us on this subject of homelessness?
Well, for one, I'll admit as a fan of spirits myself, I love that there's a whiskey pairing just involved in these conversations. That's great. And I'd be curious what our public hearing process would look like if we had a whiskey pairing.
I'm saying
the agenda items.
If you had a beer tasting at public meetings, folks would come out and have better conversations. I stand on that particular.
They'd at least have more conversations. Better, I don't know. But at least to be more words used.
Yeah.
So today, I appreciate the commissioners for you guys thinking through this. This is something we're obviously thinking about a lot. Those of us who work on homelessness is the intersection of housing instability and any number of chronic issues, be it mental challenges, physical health, and substance misuse. So for our whiskey pairing today, I want to give a shout out actually to Unity Recovery. So that's a group, the Ashford family here in Philadelphia, where I'm calling in from. And they've been taking a social enterprise approach to recovery-oriented design. And so here in my neighborhood in Roxborough, I can walk to the Unity Taqueria, I can walk to Unity Java, and I can walk to Volstead, which is a zero-proof cocktail bar. All of these are zero-proof places that employ people who are living with in recovery and also people who were formerly incarcerated. So taking a social enterprise approach of being grassroots. And so they're serving things like, I'll call out Spiritless Kentucky 74. So if you go to thezeroproof.com, if you're sober curious or in recovery, it's amazing what's happening right now with beer, with spirits, and being zero proof. So if you're like, I want to go out with my friends this weekend, but I want to have that nice cocktail, but maybe I'm not feeling like I need to put that in my system, you can be sober curious.
And also just being more for those that want to do that, you don't have to look like the odd person out at the bar anymore, because most places are now having
Right.
the list of their own, cocktails that lack alcohol, or even having recipes that are comparable that they're up offering. So I think it's softened that.
It turns out like trying to eradicate shame from all of these conversations
Yeah.
is very hard, but incredibly important.
Yeah.
I just want to go to a place that has something besides drinking as the main activity and not have to go to like a Magic the Gathering situation.
You'd
I
prefer
don't know what.
D&D instead, you mean?
No, neither. I don't want to go to a nerd conference. I just want a thing where there's activities and it doesn't have to be alcohol.
It's the after parties at Comic-Con that are always.
Hey, listen,
right.
they have bars there. I'm just like, why
I
can't
was
I
going
do
to say,
some other
I think
activity?
the intersection of nerds and drinking is still alive for those listening to the
It's
podcast
solid.
who identify
It's
as a nerd.
solid.
No offense meant.
So speaking
I
of
need
a
chess
party,
club.
speaking of a party, before we get into our interview, I'm going to have a quick moment of what our partner here at Plant Edison, Don, what do you got for us?
Yeah, I mean, we just can't be more grateful for Plant Edison and their partnership with the Planning Commission podcast. And they're doing a thing for listeners who are looking to sharpen their skills and advance their planning career. Plant Edison Courses, which is another unit of the Plant Edison organization, has more than 300 courses on a variety of cutting edge planning topics. So you can go sharpen your skills on parking reform, missing middle housing, equity, climate resilience, you name it. So if you go to courses.plantedison.com/PC10, you can take advantage of an exclusive offer for our listeners here at the Planning Commission podcast. So again, thank you, Plant Edison. Go check them out and take advantage of the services they offer.
Absolutely. Go get a discount while you're at it. So, all right, Wyatt, hit us. Who the heck are you now? Now that you've talked about the whiskey pairing and you're a big fan of libations. All right, who are you, your background, and how did you get into this world of homelessness prevention and planning to begin with?
Yeah. Well, thanks for inviting me on the podcast. You pulled on one of my good friends, Sean Rodriguez, not long ago. So I got to watch her episode and hear her talking about housing, which is great. So I appreciate all you're doing right now to kind of uplift these questions and these really difficult conversations. So I worked on the issue for homelessness for a while now. In 2009, I would have been working in political campaigns. Did that all through college and was that person that you were trying to avoid when they knocked on the door or called you in the afternoon. That was me, trying to get you to register to vote or come out to the
Knew it.
Yep. But I wanted to do something different. So I did a year of AmeriCorps and moved down to DC. And I could have worked on a number of things, but I happened to find housing, which I didn't know much about it. And so fast forward, I was suddenly doing low-income home repair in Northern Virginia and Southern Arlington, out in Fairfax. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can judge me. I shouldn't be the one doing your low-income home repair. But I was. There I was. But I got to hear all these stories from homeowners who hadn't been upstairs in 10 years because of their disability. People that were, the toxins in their house were literally killing them, but they couldn't afford to move because they've been priced out of the neighborhood they were currently living in. Places that were being fined $100 a day for a minor repair from their HOA, but they were living on fixed income. And it just opened my mind to this idea of grassroots organizing, intersecting with politics, intersecting with economics, and all of that cross-section of housing instability. So I never looked back. Yeah, so from there to work at a domestic violence shelter in Arlington, to move back home to Philadelphia, where I worked until I moved out to Boise, Idaho, where I ran an organization called Catch, which is still out there. And when listening to Boise, Idaho, go and support our really awesome friends at Catch, who work to end homelessness in the Treasure Valley. And so now I'm consulting. So now I help state governments, I help local communities design out their, which we'll talk about this term, supportive housing strategies. How can we actually move from a world where we're changing the built environment so that it does course correct for those who are living in shelter or on the streets today?
Awesome. Jess, you have a question?
I do. So, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier about what causes homelessness and things. So can you tell me what homeless actually means? What's that definition? Who classifies, maybe what those demographics are, and maybe just some statistics, break that down for us. Give us a good definition around that.
Yeah, this is where I give you a definition while vastly disappointing you. Because like all things that come down to government definitions, at least, it's a little bit the eye of the beholder. So the HUD definition, at least around homeless, usually throws the word literal in front of it. So if we talk about literal homelessness, we're talking to people that are sleeping either A, fleeing domestic violence actively, or B, they're living in a place not meant for human habitation. So that could be in a shelter tonight, that could be on the street, that could be in a place with no power, no running water, a place that's unsafe. So that's usually our definition. When you hear a lot of,
That's it.
if you hear
Those
our
two
count,
things?
if you hear like a HUD-based count, like maybe you've heard of the point in time count that happens every single January, that's just looking at that. Who's actively in one of those categories, either category 1, we call it, or category 4 for domestic violence. But if you're talking to the school system, the Department of Education includes another category, but you'll hear maybe called doubled up or couch surfing, someone we're overcrowded in a situation. So I don't have a stable place to be. I'm living that instability and I'm moving from place to place to place to place. But Department of Education includes that as well. So homelessness as a term typically refers to someone who's actively, or a household is actively on the street. And then at risk of homelessness usually refers to people that are either about to be evicted and or are couch surfing. In terms of statistics, like this is one of the hardest things we have here. Unfortunately, this point in time count, which is what everyone is reading in the newspaper once a year, is frankly, it's helpful from a trend analysis to look at what's happened in the last 10 years. It is not a helpful number in of itself, because every single jurisdiction has to go around and count the number of people they can find. If you're in the Matsu Borough outside of Anchorage, Alaska, a place that's larger than 3 states, it's really hard to do a count like that in January. And so the number isn't terribly reliable, but it suggests that we have roughly about 600,000 people on a given night experiencing literal homelessness. But we also know from our homeless services system and our data that that number is at least half of what we expect. So last year, we saw about 1.2 million people touch our homeless response system through shelters around the country. And that number would still be an undercount. So there's a lot going on right now.
So I even think even within those definitions and with your example of the Matsu Borough, where ironically all of us have worked at some point in time on things, what are some other things that people may not know about homelessness, whether it's from the planning side, the economic side, any of those factors? What's the myth busting that you have to constantly do?
Yeah, I think the biggest myth is a positive one, which is that people have way more strengths than we give them credit for. Whenever we say the word homelessness, I think immediately it becomes a demoralizing conversation, because we use terms that I think put a lot of stigma around them. So for one, a lot happens. So let's look at eviction, for instance. There's been some research, not a lot, but there's been a lot of emerging research on eviction. The way I hear people talk about it is they assume that 100% of people that get evicted end up in an emergency shelter not that long after. Research varies, but actually we see about 5% of people that get evicted end up in shelter. So there's actually something that happens. People have strengths. They do have support networks. They are able to figure it out. Are they in the best of scenarios after you've been evicted? No, of course not. And that eviction can follow you. And there's a lot of, it's harder to get housing when you have evictions on your record. But something happens. People are able to triage their own situation. I think the same thing happens once we house people. We use a philosophy called housing first, which suggests that as the most stable we can get your brain architecture is by getting you out of the trauma of homelessness and into a stable place as soon as possible. And when we do, you're more likely to be successful in your case planning, your treatment planning, getting a job. Things happen. Like we see in housing first that 80% of the time you're stably housed a year later. So even if you've been experiencing homelessness, like it's not, it doesn't have to be this panacea of doom that I think we describe it. People have strengths. We just have built up systems of care that are broken. They are broken AF, and we need to start repairing things back together. But once we do, we see signs of success.
So Wyatt, I'm thinking about as a as a practicing planner, always in the data swimming pool, so to speak, you talking about going back a second about the point in time survey and it being done in January. And I'm kind of thinking to myself, what does it look like in July? Is homelessness in this country in any way seasonal? And I think, for example, like when we do, leaning on census information, well, you better be careful on that, right? Because we know we've heard horror stories about how that might get collected to begin with, but the margins of error in some cases being greater than the number that's even there. But I'm just kind of generally curious about that point in time being in January. Is there anything to that? Do things change in July? What's the logic behind counting in January versus other times of the year? I'm just kind of that statistical side of things.
Yeah, it's the right question. And I think you could add seasonality on top of any number of factors, because I think the word, like Jess used the word cause earlier, and I think, like in all statistical endeavors, like causation is a catch term. It's something we should look at and be curious about, and it's really hard. There's a book out there, if you haven't checked it out, housing or homelessness is a housing problem.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen that, and what I really appreciate that Greg Colburn, professor out of University of Washington, did in this book is isolate a lot of these myths and with the data we have available and say, okay, is the cause mental illness? Is the cause seasonality? Is the cause, this or that? Let's look at each of these and try to find some aggregate data that can compare this. And his conclusion, I think, is one that those of us in the business have known for a long time, which is that there's only really, if we can call it a cause, there's only really one cause of homelessness on an aggregate level, and that's housing. It's housing prices. The more you appreciate, like the rates of mental illness don't have like the same reaction to it. Like let's look at Delaware, for instance. Delaware is one of the epicenters right now of the opioid crisis. So in the way we tell the narrative, therefore they should see really high rates of homelessness. They don't. They actually have one of the lowest rates of unsheltered homelessness, even though they have some of the highest rates of opioid addictions. So there's a lot of this myth busting, and it's all of us, I think, for us just to look away from the planning question, which is how can we be better built in our built environment, so that we are allowing more housing at the right density level, at the right affordability level, for the right length of time from affordability window, so that we can actually have these mixed income neighborhoods that we say we all want, but then you go to a planning commission like this podcast, and then you see that, actually the one thing that we can get liberals and conservatives to agree on is that they actually don't want multifamily in their neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Oh, it's wild to me. I can't find, so as somebody trying to live alone, it has been so hard. And I've talked about this some episodes back. It is so tough to find right-sized housing. And I'm someone that doesn't have I've not experienced any of the things that are on kind of the cause of homelessness, and I'm quite, I'm very fortunate in that way. But I mean, it feels very teetery, right? Looking for right-sized housing. So I cannot even, it's hard for me to even imagine what that's like. If you have any of these little, kind of this three-legged stool of being able to find housing for yourself. What if my income wasn't what it was, and it's just so painful to think about. So I'm wondering also, so when you're kind of going down that path of a planning and zoning, like what are some trends that need to be looked at more in what we're doing in planning specifically? So there's a lot of talk about zoning reform right now, and so kind of digging more into that. What do you think? What should we be focused on?
Yeah, I mentioned housing first earlier, so maybe I'll give some quick definitions and then back to your question. Yes. So I work on supportive housing, which is mostly what it sounds like, which is I get in fights sometimes with my housing developer friends. And yes, I work on the issue of homelessness, but I do have friends that are developers. It can happen.
Sure. Somebody's got to build it.
But I think developers, have too much bought into this idea of supply and demand at an aggregate level. That, if we just build enough, be it luxury housing or this I consider roughly a made up term of workforce housing, which is also in most places just called market rate housing. If we just build enough of that, eventually we'll cascade down so that there is affordable housing. I think a lot of like the John Maynard Keynes sentence, which is in the long run, we're all dead. I think like if we have 1.2 million people experiencing homelessness this year, trying to tell them that in 30 years we're gonna build enough luxury housing today, so in 30 years you have full housing, is a really inhumane argument to make at a community planning level. So one, I think, is understand that we have to build housing for people, which means we have to understand who is in our community and not just build one size fits all, like you said, Chris, style approaches, whether it be it single family zoning or frankly, if we go multifamily, but if we only build luxury, market rate and luxury, then we're still making a different kind of mistake. So supportive housing really looks backwards and says, okay, we want to build housing for people experiencing homelessness, specifically those who have deeper service needs. So we need to figure out the actual housing. So what are we building? What does it look like? How we can make sure it's safe? And it's permanent housing. This is, I think, something that gets missed a lot. We've moved away from the idea that what we should be building is transitional housing. People deserve to have a lease in their name that gives them tenant stability and tenant rights. And we know that from a health standpoint, when you have stability, you can overcome some of the trauma that's happening in your brain right now. So we need housing, permanent housing. We need services. So let's specifically tie services. Let's not just say, and then you will navigate the system we have built for you, knowing that there aren't enough psychiatric care in most places. There isn't in-home care that's available to you. Most insurance probably may not even cover it. Like, no, we're going to design a services approach so that all you have to do is walk downstairs. And the last one is rental assistance. How can we help you pay for your rent for at the very least a short term, if not a long term? Well, to do supportive housing, I just list at least 3 different systems that we now have to pull together to make work, and all of it assuming that the zoning even allows us to do it wherever we find. So if you want to add planning as like a subset of all of that, there's just so many systems we have to pull together: behavioral health, physical health, housing authorities and vouchers. We have to pull together planning and zoning. We have to pull together developers and therefore financing behind it. We have to pull together so many things to try to build housing that the barrier to entry is just so high. So then therefore it gets you back to the planning question. How can we just make it easier?
Well,
I think that's where me and the luxury developers probably do agree. It's like, how can we make it easier to build housing?
Well, and some of this is like hot off the presses, and we're recording this in May, so it'll air at a different time. But just yesterday, Salt Lake City setting new rules for placing homeless shelters and essentially opening up the zones in which it would be allowed and predicated on certain services being available. So that seems like a step, at least at that end of the spectrum. What are some other policy levers that can get at those types of things?
Yeah, I think, allowable use is huge. I mean, the nice thing about supportive housing is it's just a certain density level. So it's a, apartment building. So as long as you're allowing, apartments at the right density, it should be allowed there. So how can we allow more? Again, is like the density question. Obviously, if we can add some density bonuses and things like that to really make this pencil a little bit better, would be great. But then a lot of the policy levers probably live outside of directly planning. There's a lot we have to figure out from Medicaid. There's a lot of cool innovations happening right now, which is Medicaid's about like 12 to 15% of the entire economy is this insurance program we have. But yet it hasn't traditionally thought about housing.
Yeah.
It's yet, even though we know that if I'm 100% of a person, healthcare only accounts for about 20% of my health, right? The built environment, my social factors, my genetics are the rest, and my behaviors. So healthcare should then care a lot about these social influencers like housing. And it hasn't. It's a relatively new concept to integrate these social determinants and that. So how can we get Medicaid to be a payer on this, which a lot of states are figuring out. Idaho is not one of them. I'm in Pennsylvania. We're not one of them yet. So there's things to figure out there. There's a lot of policy levers at a national and a state level. And some of them is like to the construction costs of building housing have ballooned. And so I appreciate there's a lot of talk. There's a mayoral race happening in Philadelphia right now. There's a lot of talk about rental assistance, which is great. We need rental assistance, but it's also still pouring water into a broken pot. Like if we don't change some of the financing structures it takes to build things, then we can't, then our needs for rental assistance will always be exponential. They'll always grow unless we change the cost at which we got that land and then we built that thing. Because then obviously that's how we're building our cash flow, and cash flow lives off of rent. So we have to think a little further up. Like that's where I think I love the planning, working for planning backwards. Because if we think about planning, we're thinking about land. If we think about land, how can we think about getting land cheaper? So if you're a city and you're listening to this, how can you like land lease some land that you own to a developer who can build some supportive housing? Okay, great. That's your land lease is going to be like 12% of the whole development cost. Hey, that's a chunk. That helps us out a lot. I'm looking at 12% discount on something. So I think there's a ton of policy levers, Don, that we can walk through. It gets complicated.
Well, I think it's great to point out, and it's something, it just, the depths of everything related to housing is these external influences on the planning side of things that we can't control. And then going back to what you said of just simply a supply and demand argument misses so many of those points. And it's one, I think it's what makes it difficult, but also it's what makes it frustrating as well.
Well, can I flip this around? What do you three think right now? What's the level of awareness around the role of planning on homelessness? Is it just is it still academic at this point, or are people with some zoning rewrites happening around the country like Minneapolis and Boise's looking at it? Is the awareness now turning into actual action?
I think it's getting to a more enlightened thing. And I think I've said in the beginning, I think some of the lessons learned and stuff within COVID and in the wake of COVID, I think have brought that up. I mean, if you were to say what's a major city that would be the first one or one of the first few to just open up the ability to put a shelter in places, I don't know that Salt Lake City would be the first place a lot of people would think about. So I think the awareness in the mid metros and others is probably a positive thing, but I still think it probably gets weaponized in the political realm way too much at this point. And I don't know how we solve that. Chris?
Yeah, I got some thoughts on this.
Like Chris just gave a smirk that says,
well,
hold my beer, here comes 20 minutes.
So I've been working in some communities recently where there is, especially on the unsheltered side of the paradigm, a healthy population of folks. And I know that it's incredibly stressful for obviously the people who are experiencing it. But then there's the other part of it too, is, city leaders and residents even saying, how do we handle this? And so, for example, and I'm going to be very basic here, but I know a large city I was working with in California, and them saying, well, we know we have a mental health crisis, and it's compounded when we have, frankly, a legalization of drugs, and kind of going, well, heck, how do we battle this? People have their individual rights as well. Right? They have a right to live. They don't have there's not a right for someone to come in and say, hey, we are forcing treatment upon you, right? Because that's not a right. And so it's another part of this discussion. And again, I think that's more on the unsheltered side of things. I do think that there's been a lot of folks who recognize the temporarily sheltered who definitely need help too. And I think I'm happy to hear that, because I don't think that's always historically been the case. I think that most people, when they still to this day, when you say the word homeless, they'll think of the person who's unsheltered, and they see front and center, versus obviously, as you know, the vast majority of folks who that's not their situation. And, obviously a part of a population segment that needs, additional help, whether it's, permanent supportive housing and all the different treatments that you're up, trying to do. So that's a different way of answering your question. It was a question I wanted to ask you, but you beat me to it. So I don't know if you have a response to that.
Yeah, and even getting to that differentiation, I think you're exactly right, is needed in the planning, and especially like the political space of saying, like, we need a strategy for unsheltered populations. We need a strategy for sheltered populations. Your strategies for families with children will look very different than your strategies for unaccompanied youth. Unaccompanied youth, I think, is one that doesn't really get much spotlight. Unaccompanied youth, especially the prevalence we see is really hitting hard for our transgender communities, our LGBTQ plus communities, our people of color. Like youth is a big problem that we're really not discussing, especially not seeing much community planning happening on. So HUD's trying to push on that at a federal level, but I don't see a lot of smaller metro areas doing a lot around it. So you have to get that that discriminatory, like that specific, I should say, on each of these different tranches of homelessness, because the strategies look a little bit different. But at the end, at the core of it all is, do you have enough housing? Do you have supportive services? And how are you paying for rental assistance?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna ask my question to you then. So here's the way I'm gonna ask you. It's a little bit of curveball. Are there non-planning based or housing based policies and decisions that you see in a regional or even a national level that make your job harder? That whether it's in, as I mentioned, whether it's the mental health segment, transportation, you name it, there's a whole host of things that affect people's lives who are or are on the brink of experiencing homelessness. What might those things be that you go, gosh, you just made it more difficult on us?
Oh, geez, Chris, too many things flash before my eyes.
Top three. We'll do survey says. Number
Yeah,
three, most
I saw
popular answer.
Yeah, I saw the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future.
Oh no.
I think a couple things come to mind. I mean, just criminalization in general comes to mind. And a few things like the criminalization of homelessness, I think, is one, and like you see that with anti-camping ordinances. Very famously, the city of Boise, went had a petition up in the Supreme Court that got into the circuit court there, and they built some parameters around on how we could regulate camping, illegal camping in cities. I don't think that, even for advocates, I think showed, or like, we're very happy with that ruling, but ultimately I think there's still plenty more to do, because you're still seeing a lot of criminalization happen around the country. I think the criminalization of drugs is a huge issue as well. Is we're using our prison system as a shelter.
Yeah.
And so I think with a lot of our shelter systems also being pretty frayed as well, I feel like we've got a prison system and a shadow prison system, which is our shelters are incredibly well-meaning, and a lot of places are terribly underfunded. And so they're warehousing people, because that's all we can do is we just create, bunks upon bunks upon bunks, because all we have is this old Salvation Army building from 1960, and we can't afford to move it because of the aforementioned like zoning problems. I can't put it somewhere else to build a more modern shelter. So I think the criminalization around homelessness, the criminalization around drugs really makes this a lot more difficult. So those are two that come to mind. The third one is just, I think I'm having a lot of conversations with smaller cities. And I think they're finally coming to grips on their role in the built environment. I think a lot of smaller cities that don't have a housing department, they don't maybe have a health authority. This is new. Yeah. This is very new for them to say, I have a role in helping to end homelessness. Are you like, I have the one code enforcement guy, and Jerry doesn't work on Fridays.
Yeah.
Like
Jerry.
Like it's just hard to.
Always Jerry.
Always Jerry. And
well, I was gonna
Jerry.
ask you this, because we're working on a rural livability guidebook for AARP. So I wanted to ask, what's the rural story with homelessness? I mean, you mentioned like the Matsu borough where Jess used to work, and we've done some consulting, so we know that geography and everything. But what's the piece that people don't know about when we come to a rural context?
Yeah, I did some work up in the Matsu as well. I'm glad we can all.
Thank you.
Let's just use the Matsu. I mean, you've got two smaller towns, population centers there, and then one natural
Palmer
thing.
and Wasilla, for people that.
That's right, Palmer and
You
Wasilla.
can see Rush. No, I'm just kidding.
What about Houston?
Yes, Houston and Squitna.
So
can you stop?
Trying to, if you want to name them all, I can.
He's trying so hard. Okay, Palmer and Wasilla, everybody knows it's right there. They're 10 miles apart.
So trying to do like street outreach, which is like a key
Yeah.
access point, is key. How do you do street outreach in a place like the Matsu Borough? Like, it's so difficult. And so one innovation that happened about 10 years ago in homelessness is called coordinated entry. Like, wouldn't it be great if we had the one-stop shop? Well, the one-stop shop works more effectively in an urban environment, but in a rural environment, just transportation becomes a massive issue, right? Immediately. And so the accessing services becomes very, very hard. We had this conversation with West Virginia recently, which is there's this model called assertive community treatment, which is a well-known model for people with severe mental illness. And you build a team, and this team works with you together. And it's basically like trying to be a hospital on wheels. Well, if there's a mountain range, if there's an Appalachian mountain range between your two towns, then how does the psychiatrist get over there in winter?
Mhm.
Well, telehealth is really effective strategy usually, but you need a relationship for it to be successful for people with, severe mental illness, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, for anyone needs a relationship with their medical professionals. So that's just become very difficult in rural areas. So I think the challenges there, I think, are just as great as they are in urban communities, but we just get caught up on the numbers because there's obviously more people in LA experiencing homelessness than there are in Rigby.
So I
Well-
think that what I've learned today is that the homelessness, if we're going to call it a problem, it just is a thing that is experienced in life, and it's because we all go through transitions, right? And some folks are falling through the cracks and they're becoming unhoused at some point. The list of reasons that folks end up there is something that any of us can experience, right? And so what the trouble is having the ability and having the housing and having the facility that makes sense for someone going through something traumatic, whatever that is. And so this is all really rough stuff. So you're sitting here with bright eyes and a smile on your face. Wyatt, why are you so optimistic? Do you think that there is a way out? Do you think that there's a future where we figured this out, where we can support people in our world that are having these things happen and they need help?
I feel like I have to. I mean,
Oh my gosh. I hope so, because I'm just gonna
I don't
cry.
consider myself, and those who know me wouldn't consider me an optimistic person, but I think you get determined. And for me, I've just met too many people who are living on the street. They go and you eat with them at a soup kitchen, that, like, shame on me if I don't dedicate myself to a cause like that. And it's that for me, it's homelessness. And the reality is that we are seeing some systemic changes, though we have a very broken systems in this country, and we have a lot to figure out. We haven't even talked about, racism in this conversation yet, and how that's impact on homelessness. There are a ton of systems we need to really figure out. But the reality is that during the pandemic, veterans homelessness went down. During the pandemic, family homelessness went down. So we're starting to see, we have these huge success stories. We made a lot of success on chronic homelessness, those who are unsheltered for like a year or experienced homelessness for over a year. That has changed since 2016. I'll let you do the math on what was maybe different in 2016. But we need to figure out this chronic standpoint. That's where we're really getting it's getting out of hand for a lot of our communities to figure out what we can do on chronic homelessness, which really intersects with our behavioral health questions, very much intersects with our planning questions, as people are doing economic development in their towns and want to see a change there, while they're also seeing unsheltered homelessness increase. But again, we're seeing successes. It happens. And we know that once we get people housed through a housing first mindset, it works. So we just need to scale that. And we're just not right now showing the ability to scale it at a community level, at a state level, and definitely not at a country level. But I'm determined to wake up tomorrow and keep helping.
I'm glad you
And
do.
a lot of people are better off for it. So we thank you for your efforts. All right, Wyatt, let's have some fun for the last few minutes that we have you here.
Lightning round.
Lightning
Oh,
round.
Yeah.
We need
This is
more
All
at
the
this
round.
point.
I didn't prep. This is the round where I say my favorite lightning storms. Is that? That's
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Your favorite song with lightning in the title. And yeah. All right, here's my first question. Are you ready? Okay. Boys to Men, Hall & Oates, or Will Smith? Which Of these favorite Philly sons, do you wish were not from Philly?
Well, see, I mean, the slap heard around the world, I think, changed some things with Will Smith. So even though I grew up watching Fresh Prince and loved it, I think unfortunately I'm gonna have to go with Will right now. Sorry, Will.
Summertime was not good for him last year, right? It's brutal. So that makes sense. Makes sense.
But his song "Summertime," still slaps.
That's the reference. Some people will get that. Some people will not.
I'm just so glad all of my, snap decisions aren't caught on camera because I'd probably be in trouble.
It's like slapping somebody at the Oscars.
If anyone needs a really random like podcast recommendation, which no one
yes, I do.
Go for it.
Listen to Questlove Supreme.
Yes, Questlove. He's
Questlove, and listen to the episode where Boyz II Men comes on, because Questlove and Boyz II Men went to high school in Philly.
Of course they did.
Something about listening to Boyz II Men curse that much, I was like, this is not nice. I know you guys were so.
That's why we all listened to them. That's why all us
end of the
girls listened to
road,
them in the
right
90s.
there, end of the road.
All right, a Beyond Meat Philly cheesesteak, thumbs up or thumbs down?
Ooh, God.
Ooh. What's wrong with you?
John Kerry would still eat it with a fork if anybody wants to remember that story from 20 years ago.
I like it. I don't know. It tastes like meat to me.
I mean, I gotta go thumbs down. No offense to people who want to participate, but I gotta go thumbs down. And especially if you had said on like a cheesesteak outside of Philly, that regardless of what it is, that's a thumbs down.
Oh yeah.
Has to be the Amoroso roll.
It's a faux steak.
Get that Schuylkill River water to help it with its bread. Yeah.
That's the detail, huh? It's not the millions of them that have been all seasoned on that same flat top. That's not the key. It's the river water.
I've heard
It's
that
the
over and
Amoroso
over.
roll. And if you freeze it and ship it, which they do, that's something. But I had a friend in Boise when I lived there that would always order the cheesesteak whenever he was around me just to piss me off. Thanks, Chase Erkins.
Name names. That's what's
Way to
important.
go,
So what do you
Chase.
miss about living in Boise?
Is that part of the lightning round?
Yeah.
Well,
this is a side question, a different round.
I gotta go obviously with my friends. I met so many amazing humans there, and I miss biking. I mean, the planned environment there, I just biked everywhere. I lived on the bench and was able just to, someone could text me and say, hey, we're at Barbarian. What are you doing right now? And I'd go, okay, let me get out of these pajamas into my jeans. I'll be there. And I could be there in 20 minutes like that.
Nice.
The accessibility and how easy it was to meet up with friends.
Nice.
I like it. So is it really always sunny in Philadelphia?
Not bad right now.
The show I'm talking about, right?
Oh yeah, of course.
It's like, if anybody has not watched that show, I mean, my other show that Dawn knows about is oh God, it's not Longmire, it's the other Meyer,
Brockmire.
Brockmire. Oh
That's
God,
right.
but
Such
it's always
dudes.
sunny in Philadelphia. Can you relate to any of the characters on that show?
Yeah, it's like the dive bar culture in Philly is a very specific thing. And so I think patties exist. Like there are, as they joke, there aren't dive bars here. They're just called bars. So the idea that the drugs are just around the block, I think is right. So the idea of like, I mean, Philly is still the poorest major metro area. And so we have some very, very blighted neighborhoods. So the most people come here and visit Rittenhouse Square. You got to go some other neighborhoods and sit in a dive bar. And it's a kind of bar where you got to walk in, order a shot and a beer so that all the regulars go, okay, he's fine.
That's what he's doing.
So yeah, I'd say you recognize. And
They're
the idea
not
that
walking in, ordering that Sazerac up and
correct.
expected. Yeah.
Correct. If you order the martini, they will just kick you out. Yeah.
So as a planning nerd who's never been to Philadelphia, where do I go? What's the weird place I need to go and not the place everybody else is going to go?
I mean, that's not a weird wreck, but just getting into neighborhoods. So sure, see Center City. I'm a history nerd, so yes, go and see the founding of the country.
There's
go
pictures.
Explore all of that. The Museum of the American Revolution is super cool and relatively new. But then yeah, go out into West Philly. Go south of Christian Street, in South Philly and see some neighborhoods there, and just go get a cheesesteak there. Go and get a cheesesteak on any place that just says steak on the wall, a mom and pop shop down there, and you'll have a meal, that you'll talk about for the rest of your life.
Have you ever booed or thrown snowballs at Santa Claus?
What?
I have not,
Oh,
no.
okay. All right. Well, that's a Philly tradition too, while we're on that.
I mean, I'm going to the Sixers game in, 15 minutes, so I
Oh,
will
cool.
be booting at the Celtics in not that long.
Good.
No
Good.
snowballs.
Good.
And I hopefully won't throw anything.
As a lifelong Laker fan, please boo the living hell out of the Celtics. You're blessed. Thank you for doing so.
It's got to feel
Brent-
good to have the Sixers be relevant again. And
It will feel even better if they can actually get out of the second round.
yeah,
Which unfortunately has not happened.
Okay. The responsibility relies on you to change a brand new toilet paper roll. Is it over or under?
This is really where we judge you.
Yeah, that's where we're going.
It's over.
Yeah, of
That's
course
the
it is.
correct answer.
I agree. I knew he would answer that because he pronounced Appalachia correctly.
Oh my!
earlier in the
By the
episode,
way,
so
I was
knew
in
he
a
would
lunch
know.
meeting where they argue with me, and they're like, "It's Appalachia," and I was like, "I don't know what's wrong. I just can't talk about this."
Do people advocate for under? Is there a big under lobby?
I think it's a subculture.
People say Appalachia,
Yeah.
so I don't know what to tell you. Maybe it's the toilet paper thing.
Does it just
They
fall?
just think they're right.
Fall? You just
Have you? We've all been to someone's home,
Where they
and
do it
you
that
look and
way.
you go, "It's under." What are they thinking? But
I would flip it.
Yeah, no, I
You'd
changed
flip it?
I just
you
fixed
would.
it.
Would you flip it or no longer be their friend?
Oh, God, no, you
I
wanna
would
help
bring it
somebody
up.
out.
I mean, the Philly in me that's seen Seinfeld enough knows that that's a conversation. That's a whole episode.
I
So,
can
like-
see that. I can see that.
This is
So you're an under kind of a person, huh?
Yeah.
Look,
You
what
know
else
who-
are you
Talk
lying
about
to?
it.
You know who does under all the time, and now you'll notice this?
Stop.
Airplane restrooms.
Oh, they
Mm.
do. You know why?
I don't know
figured
why.
This out. I think I figured it out.
But you
It's
can't
because-
flip those.
No, you
That's
can't.
true.
But you know what? The thing about an under is it just keeps going and going. And if you do it in the over in the airplane, it's going to get stuck on something. I
Yeah,
think
but
that's what
then
it
when
is.
they do the under in like the US Forest Service pit toilets, that's like the worst situation they could
You're
be
right.
doing that because it
I
doesn't.
think it's just the revenge of the
planning.
flight attendant. They're just like, watch this. We're gonna get
They
everybody
have
right
control.
here. So.
Really, they're all.
All right. Well, on that note, let us bring this episode to a close. Wyatt Schroeder, principal at Bowling Business Strategies. We so appreciate your time talking about obviously an incredibly powerful subject that unfortunately affects a lot of Americans, but we are very fortunate in that you are on the front line doing everything that you can to try to minimize that as much as possible. So Wyatt, thank you so much for joining us on the Planning Commission podcast.
Thanks for having me. This is great. Yeah, appreciate the energy in this room, and let's change some minds. Let's get some zoning rewrites in here. Let's make it easier to get affordable housing.
Well, and thanks for everything you did
Here.
here in Boise and that. It's still talked about a lot, and we miss having you here.
No doubt about that.
I miss you all,
So,
Boise.
all right.
Oh.
All right. Well, as a reminder to our audience, please hit up our website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. Like and subscribe. And until next time, I need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Amen.
All right. See you all the next time. Appreciate it. Take care. Hey, everybody. Commissioner Danley here. Would you like to see more? Hear more? Well, we got you covered. Go to our website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. It's got everything you want. Guests, yep, past episodes, the video, the audio, even our whiskey pairing, links to everything about all the people we've had on, books, websites, you name it. It's unbelievable. If you want to reach out to us, please. We'd be more than happy to chat. You can email us, planningcommissionpodcast@gmail.com. If you want to tweet at us, go for it, @planningcommish. We're also on YouTube with the Planning Commission Podcast channel, Facebook. Heck, send us a carrier pigeon if you need to. We'd love to hear from you about ideas, guests, you name it. Thank you for listening. We appreciate it. We'll keep doing our thing. You keep doing yours. Have a good one.